Tourist disrespects royal guard. The guard's reaction left everyone speechless. Emotional stories. The morning sun was shining brightly over the historic royal palace. The air was crisp, carrying a mix of excitement and curiosity that always seemed to gather around this famous tourist spot. People from all over the world had come to see the grand palace, its magnificent gates, and the famous royal guards who stood perfectly still, their uniforms immaculate and their expressions serious. The palace had always been a symbol of tradition and respect, and the guards were not just there to protect it. They were a living part of its history, representing centuries of discipline and pride. Crowds of tourists moved slowly along the wide cobblestone streets leading up to the palace. Some stopped to take photos of the ornate gates, while others admired the flowers and fountains that decorated the area. Street performers added music and laughter to the scene, and vendors sold souvenirs ranging from miniature replicas of the palace to traditional snacks. Children ran excitedly, pointing at the guards and laughing as their parents tried to keep up. Everywhere you looked, there was energy, curiosity, and a sense of wonder. Among the visitors was a young woman named Emma. She was a lively tourist, visiting the palace for the first time. Her friends had told her about the palace's beauty, the famous guards, and the strict rules that everyone was supposed to follow when near them. But Emma was feeling playful and carefree, excited by the idea of capturing perfect photos for her social media. She had traveled far, and in her mind, this visit was supposed to be all fun and laughter. She barely noticed the signs that warned visitors to keep a respectful distance from the guards. The royal guards stood at their posts near the palace gates, their posture flawless, their faces calm and unreadable. They wore traditional uniforms that looked heavy and formal, complete with polished boots, gloves, and tall hats. They didn't blink often, didn't move unless necessary, and their presence alone demanded respect. Tourists often watched them in fascination, some trying to get the perfect photograph, others simply admiring their discipline. Many had heard stories about visitors attempting to test the guards' patience, but very few dared to act disrespectfully, knowing the history and importance of their role. Emma approached the first guard with her camera in hand. She giggled quietly to herself, thinking it would be funny to take a picture while making silly faces next to him. She crouched down, adjusted her camera, and made a playful expression. The guard didn't react. He stayed perfectly still, his eyes forward, seemingly unaware of her antics. Emma found this amusing. "Wow, these guys are really serious," she whispered to her friend, who was standing nearby, equally entertained. Her friend tried to warn her gently, but Emma waved her off, thinking she was just overreacting. As Emma continued, she stepped closer to the guard, leaning slightly toward him for a better angle. She didn't notice that a small crowd had started forming behind her, quietly observing the interaction. Some onlookers smiled, expecting the guard to finally react, while others looked concerned, sensing that Emma's behavior might cross a line. The guard's expression remained unchanged, but the air around him seemed heavier, filled with the unspoken authority that comes from years of training and pride. Emma laughed louder now, pretending to touch the guard's hat and making exaggerated poses. She thought it was harmless fun, but the guard remained silent, his eyes fixed straight ahead. His stillness was not just about discipline, it was a way of teaching respect without words. He had dealt with countless tourists over the years, some curious, some careless, and some disrespectful. Each time, he had learned to maintain his composure, knowing that any overt reaction could escalate the situation. His quiet presence was stronger than any words could be. The other tourists began to notice Emma's behavior. Some shook their heads, thinking she was being rude, while others tried to watch discreetly, curious about how the guard would respond. The atmosphere changed slightly. What had been a lively, cheerful morning now carried a subtle tension. The guards were not there to entertain anyone, yet their presence always drew attention. People admired their dedication, their ability to remain calm under scrutiny, and the way they embodied centuries of tradition. Emma's friend finally spoke up, nudging her gently. "Maybe we should just take normal pictures and move along," she suggested quietly. Emma waved her off, insisting she could still have fun. She crouched lower for a dramatic shot and laughed loudly, completely absorbed in the moment. But the crowd's attention was shifting. Whispers and glances moved through the small group of onlookers, and Emma didn't notice that her actions were starting to make others uncomfortable. She was caught in her own excitement, forgetting the basic rule that respect often mattered more than fun in places like this. The sun was now higher in the sky, casting a warm golden light on the palace gates and the guards standing beneath them. Tourists continued to wander around, some capturing selfies, others marveling at the architecture, but the focal point remained the young woman and the silent guard. Every tiny movement she made seemed exaggerated in contrast to the calm and composed figure before her. The moment felt almost like a scene from a story, where innocence, curiosity, and respect collided in a very public space. Emma leaned even closer, now trying to make the guard smile by waving her hands in front of him and making silly faces. She giggled, thinking she had achieved the perfect shot, but the guard's eyes never wavered. He did not flinch, did not react, and certainly did not smile. His posture was straight, his hands held perfectly at his sides, and his gaze focused straight ahead. There was an invisible boundary that Emma was ignoring, one that the guard and the traditions he represented could not allow to be crossed without consequence. The crowd of spectators began to grow. People whispered among themselves, some pointing discreetly, some recording the moment on their phones. There was a mixture of amusement and admiration. Amusement because the young tourist was clearly oblivious to the seriousness of the situation, and admiration because the guard's discipline was extraordinary. In a world where people often demanded attention and reacted quickly, his ability to remain calm, silent, and dignified was impressive. It was a quiet reminder that respect was not just a word but an action, something felt and observed more than spoken. Emma, still unaware, finally moved in for one last exaggerated pose, pretending to tug at the edge of the guard's uniform. The guard's eyes flicked slightly, not in anger but in awareness. The small movement was enough to make the crowd lean in, sensing that a change was coming. Emma laughed nervously, thinking she had finally gotten the perfect shot, but something in the air had shifted. The playful, carefree mood of the morning had turned into a tense anticipation, as everyone watched silently, wondering how the guard would respond to this blatant disregard for tradition. At that moment, the contrast between the tourist and the guard could not have been clearer. Emma was vibrant, impulsive, and unaware, while the guard was steady, disciplined, and fully aware of every action around him. The lesson of this moment was forming naturally. Respect was not something to demand, but something to give, and the power of presence could often teach more than words ever could. The crowd held its breath, sensing that a significant lesson was about to unfold, one that would leave everyone thinking long after the morning had ended. The palace itself seemed to watch silently, the tall gates and majestic walls standing as witnesses to the unfolding scene. The sunlight reflected off the polished boots of the guards, and a gentle breeze rustled the flags above the gates. All the elements combined to create a vivid tableau, tradition facing modern curiosity, discipline confronting impulsive behavior, and a lesson waiting quietly to be delivered. Emma's laughter faded slightly as she noticed the subtle change in atmosphere, though she did not yet fully understand the gravity of the moment. By now, the other tourists were paying full attention. Cameras were lowered, whispers stopped, and even children seemed to sense that this was a special moment. Emma's friend stepped closer, urging her once more to behave, but Emma, still caught in her own excitement, hesitated. She wanted to have fun, but the weight of the moment was beginning to settle on her. The guard remained silent, his posture perfect, his eyes forward, and the crowd waited, captivated by the tension between impulsive behavior and silent authority. And so the morning continued, with the palace, the guards, and the tourists all part of a living story. A story that was about to teach one young woman and everyone watching a lesson about respect, discipline, and the quiet power of presence. The sun shone brightly, the streets buzzed with energy, and yet in that single moment time seemed to slow, focusing everyone's attention on the interaction that would soon become unforgettable. Emma, still laughing and moving closer to the guard, did not notice the subtle change in the crowd around her. People who had initially been amused now began to look uneasy. Their smiles faded as they sensed the seriousness of the moment. The palace courtyard, which had been lively and cheerful just minutes ago, now held a quiet tension. The sunlight glinted off the guard's polished boots, and his tall hat cast a small shadow on the ground. His posture remained perfect, but there was an unmistakable weight in the air, a quiet authority that made even the boldest tourists pause. Emma leaned forward, pretending to adjust the guard's uniform for a photo. She laughed loudly, thinking it would be funny to make the guard smile or react. Her friends whispered nervously, urging her to step back, but she waved them off. She had traveled a long way to see the palace, and in her mind this was all part of the experience. She didn't yet understand that some rules weren't just about tradition, they were about respect. The guard stood silently, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He did not move, not even a flicker of the eyelid betrayed any emotion, but the crowd could feel the tension building. They had seen tourists joke around before, but there was something different about this young woman's behavior. She was not just curious, she was testing boundaries. She didn't realize that every action, every gesture was being observed, not just by the guards but by everyone nearby. Emma, oblivious to the growing tension, suddenly crouched down for a low-angle photo. She leaned in closer than she should have, and in doing so, her elbow brushed against the edge of the guard's uniform. The small contact did not provoke a visible reaction, but it was enough to catch the attention of nearby onlookers. Some gasped quietly, while others whispered, "She's going too far." The playful energy of the morning was now replaced with a curious mixture of anticipation and concern. The guard, a man named Thomas, had been standing in this spot for nearly 3 hours already. He had grown accustomed to the presence of tourists, but Thomas had also learned patience. He knew that reacting aggressively could cause chaos, but ignoring blatant disrespect could also set a bad example. His training had taught him to remain calm, to project authority without raising his voice, and to teach lessons through presence rather than action. He inhaled slowly, feeling the familiar rhythm of his discipline as he prepared for what he hoped would be a quiet resolution. Emma's friends exchanged worried glances. "Emma, please stop," one whispered. "He's not reacting, but you're making him uncomfortable." Emma waved her off with a giggle, thinking that the guard was just shy or used to tourists. She crouched even lower, holding her camera steady, and gestured for a dramatic pose. She imagined the perfect photo, herself, smiling wildly, with the royal guard standing stoically in the background. She didn't see the lesson forming right in front of her. Thomas noticed that his peripheral vision was filled with movements, laughter, and gestures that were becoming more intrusive. The young woman's playful behavior was starting to disrupt the order of the courtyard. He could feel the collective attention of the onlookers, all watching closely, some recording, some whispering, all waiting to see what he would do. This was the moment where patience was tested, not just his own, but everyone's understanding of respect and discipline. Emma decided that the next shot would be her best one. She stepped even closer, tilting her head and laughing loudly, while pretending to fix the guard's uniform again. The crowd leaned in. Children stopped running and held their parents' hands, curious about what would happen next. Tourists raised their cameras quietly, sensing that this was no ordinary encounter. Even the vendors nearby paused, momentarily distracted by the unfolding scene. There was an almost cinematic quality to the moment, as if everyone had become part of a living tableau, each movement meaningful, each breath significant. The temperature seemed to rise slightly as Emma became more animated. She gestured wildly, pretending to push the guard lightly, laughing at her own antics. Her friends looked ready to intervene, but they were also frozen, unsure if speaking up would embarrass her further. The crowd's whispers grew louder. Some were curious, some were disapproving, and others were simply amazed at the guard's unwavering composure. Everyone sensed that a significant moment was unfolding, a moment that would teach a lesson without a single word being spoken. Thomas remained still, but his mind worked quickly. He knew that any sudden move could escalate the situation. He needed to convey authority without aggression. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he shifted his weight, grounding himself more firmly on the cobblestones. His eyes, still focused straight ahead, briefly flicked toward the young woman, not with anger but with awareness. His presence alone began to fill the space around him, creating a boundary that words could never achieve. Emma finally realized that the guard was not responding in the way she expected. There was no smile, no startled reaction, no playful gesture in return. For the first time she paused, her laughter fading slightly. She tilted her head, confused. "Why isn't he reacting?" she asked her friend quietly. Her friend shrugged, clearly impressed but also nervous. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken understanding. The lesson was already beginning, though Emma did not yet grasp it fully. The guard's stillness began to speak louder than any words could. The crowd, sensing the tension, began to whisper softly among themselves. "He's incredible," one tourist said. "Look at how calm he is." Others nodded in agreement, realizing that this was more than just a tourist interaction. It was a living example of discipline, patience, and the power of respect. Thomas's eyes, unwavering and steady, conveyed something deeper than a simple warning. They conveyed the history of the palace, the dignity of the uniform, and the importance of knowing one's place when standing before centuries of tradition. Emma, now feeling slightly uneasy, took a step back but remained close enough for another photo. She laughed nervously, sensing that she might have gone too far. The subtle shift in the crowd's energy was impossible to ignore. People who had been silently observing now subtly moved closer to see how the guard would respond. Even children, sensing the gravity of the moment, stopped playing and watched silently. The courtyard was no longer just a place of tourist activity. It had become a stage for a silent lesson about respect and awareness. The guard, sensing the need to act without speaking, raised a single hand slowly, palm facing outward, in a gentle but firm gesture. It was a small movement, yet it commanded attention. The crowd instinctively stepped back slightly, giving space to the interaction. Emma froze mid-laugh, feeling the weight of the guard's gaze and the quiet authority in his gesture. For the first time, she truly understood that her actions had consequences, and that respect was not just a suggestion, it was an expectation. The silence that followed was profound. The playful energy of the morning had dissipated, replaced by a shared understanding between the guard, the young woman, and everyone watching. Emma's friends quietly pulled her aside, and she whispered an apology, realizing how careless she had been. The guard's eyes softened slightly, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement that she had understood the lesson. His hand lowered slowly, and he returned to his original position, standing perfectly still once more. The crowd began to relax, sensing that the tension had passed. Tourists whispered excitedly about what they had just witnessed, impressed by the guard's ability to convey a lesson without a single harsh word. Emma, feeling embarrassed but also enlightened, took a step back and adjusted her behavior. She smiled politely at the guard and gave a small bow, an unspoken gesture of respect. The guard nodded slightly in return, maintaining his dignity and composure. By now, the courtyard had returned to its usual rhythm, though the impact of the moment lingered. Tourists continued to explore, but many glanced toward the guard with renewed appreciation. Emma's friends quietly reflected on the experience, realizing that travel was about more than taking fun photos. It was about understanding culture, respecting traditions, and observing the world with humility. The palace itself seemed to breathe a little easier, its gates standing tall, bearing witness to another lesson learned. As the morning continued, Emma walked slowly, taking in the palace's beauty with a newfound sense of awareness. She had come looking for fun, adventure, and pictures, but she left with something deeper, an understanding that respect was not just for rules or traditions, it was for people, for history, and for the silent guardians who preserve them. The lesson was subtle, powerful, and unforgettable, leaving an impression that would last far longer than any photograph ever could. The courtyard had quieted after the brief moment of tension, but the energy lingered in the air like a held breath. Emma had stepped back, realizing that the guard's subtle gesture was a warning, but she was still curious, still unsure of the boundaries. Her friends whispered hurriedly, urging her to behave, but she hesitated, her eyes drawn once again to the guard who had captured everyone's attention. Thomas, the guard, continued to stand at his post, perfectly still, but now his presence carried something more profound. It wasn't just discipline, it was authority, patience, and an unspoken understanding of human behavior. He could sense the curiosity and unease among the crowd, the tension still in the air, and the lingering energy of a young tourist who had tested the limits of respect. Every step she took, every laugh, every gesture was now being observed more carefully than ever, and he knew that a lesson needed to be delivered, quietly, firmly, and memorably. Emma, feeling a mix of embarrassment and fascination, took another step closer, her camera raised once again. But something had changed in her. The playful, carefree attitude that had dominated the morning was fading. She noticed the way the crowd was watching, the way people had stopped whispering and were now staring in anticipation. Even the children who had been running around were now still, quietly observing the moment. The sunlight reflecting off the guard's polished uniform seemed to make him even taller, even more imposing than before. Without a word, Thomas shifted his stance slightly. It was a tiny movement, almost imperceptible, but it carried immense weight. His hand, which had been at his side, moved slowly to rest lightly against his chest, a gesture that was both formal and commanding. His gaze, unwavering, met Emma's directly. For the first time, she felt the full impact of his eyes, not angry, not mocking, but filled with a quiet strength that made her pause. She froze mid-laugh, her playful energy drained in an instant, replaced by a growing awareness of the seriousness of the moment. The crowd held its breath. Some tourists lowered their cameras, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Others whispered softly, commenting on the guard's composure, his silent authority, and the lesson being taught without words. There was a collective understanding that this was no ordinary interaction. Thomas's presence alone was enough to command respect, and the young woman at the center of the moment was beginning to grasp the gravity of her behavior. Emma's friends finally stepped forward, gently guiding her back, but she resisted slightly, caught between curiosity and fear. She had come to the palace seeking fun and laughter, but now she was experiencing something far more profound. She could feel the weight of centuries of tradition, the discipline required to maintain such a role, and the respect that the guard commanded without ever raising his voice. It was humbling, almost overwhelming. Thomas then performed a simple but deliberate motion. He raised his hand slowly, this time higher than before, palm outward in a clear, commanding gesture. The movement was deliberate and unhurried, full of precision and authority. It was not a threat but a boundary, a reminder that respect was expected and that some lines could not be crossed. Emma froze completely, her camera lowered, her laughter gone. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, the weight of their attention pressing down gently but unmistakably. The silence in the courtyard was profound. Even the birds seemed to pause mid-flight, as if sensing the tension. Tourists whispered in hushed tones, marveling at the guard's ability to command attention without aggression. "Look at him," one woman said softly. "He doesn't need to speak a word, and yet everyone listens." Others nodded, understanding immediately the power of calm authority. Emma's friends exchanged glances, realizing that the lesson being taught was deeper than mere etiquette. It was about human behavior, awareness, and the quiet power of discipline. Emma, now trembling slightly with embarrassment, took a small step back. She felt the enormity of what she had done. Her actions, which she had thought were harmless and playful, had crossed an invisible line, and the guard's presence had conveyed the seriousness of her behavior more effectively than any scolding could have. She lowered her head slightly, a gesture of apology and humility. For the first time, she truly understood that respect was not optional, and that the royal guard's role was not just ceremonial, it was sacred. The crowd, sensing her shift in demeanor, relaxed slightly. Some smiled gently, recognizing the lesson that had been delivered. Children who had been watching curiously whispered to their parents, asking why the guard had not moved or shouted. Parents explained quietly, "He is teaching a lesson without words." That is the power of respect and discipline. The words hung in the air, reinforcing the significance of the moment and giving Emma a broader understanding of the guard's role. Thomas's eyes softened just slightly, a subtle acknowledgement that the lesson had been received. He did not smile, nor did he make any other gesture that would break the dignity of his position. His posture remained perfect, but his presence now carried a sense of completion, a silent understanding that the tourist had recognized the importance of her actions. Emma's embarrassment transformed into reflection, and her curiosity was replaced by respect. For a long moment, the courtyard remained still. Tourists who had been recording or photographing the interaction slowly lowered their devices, realizing that the most important moment was not captured by cameras, but by their own eyes and awareness. Emma's friends whispered reassurances, gently reminding her that everyone made mistakes, but true learning came from acknowledging them. She nodded silently, finally understanding that respect was not just about following rules. It was about recognizing and honoring the role and dignity of others. The guard, sensing that the moment had reached its peak, returned his hand to his side and shifted slightly, grounding himself again on the cobblestones. He remained still, his eyes focused straight ahead, a symbol of unwavering discipline. The crowd watched in awe, many reflecting silently on the power of calm authority. They had witnessed something rare, a lesson delivered not through anger, not through words, but through presence, patience, and quiet command. Emma, finally gathering her composure, stepped back fully, bowing her head slightly as a sign of apology. She spoke softly, almost whispering, "I'm sorry," not just to the guard, but to everyone watching. Her voice was humble, sincere, and heartfelt. Thomas gave the slightest nod, acknowledging her apology without breaking the dignity of his post. The interaction was complete, simple, silent, and yet profoundly impactful. The tourists around them began to murmur softly, praising the guard's composure and the lesson he had delivered. Some discussed how rare it was to witness such calm authority, especially in a world where people often demanded attention or reacted hastily. Others reflected on the young woman's journey from playful ignorance to sincere awareness, noting how quickly behavior could be corrected with dignity and patience rather than force or anger. Emma's friends quietly guided her away from the immediate area, allowing her to reflect on what had happened. She walked slowly, taking in the palace gates, the flowers, and the bustling courtyard around her with a new perspective. She realized that the day had been about far more than sightseeing. It had been about learning, observing, and understanding the power of respect and self-control. She felt a deep sense of gratitude toward Thomas, the guard who had delivered a lesson that words alone could never have conveyed. Even as the morning continued, the energy of the courtyard shifted. Other tourists began to move with more awareness, observing the rules more carefully, and noticing the unspoken authority of the guards. Children remained curious, but their curiosity was tempered with respect. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath, standing witness to a small but significant event, a lesson that would remain in the minds of everyone present long after they left. Emma, reflecting quietly on her actions, understood that respect was not just for tradition, but for people, history, and the shared values that connected everyone. She realized that the guard's reaction, silent, composed, and unwavering, had communicated more than any lecture or reprimand could have. It was a lesson in patience, discipline, and the quiet power of presence, and it was one that she would remember forever. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the memory of the moment lingered in the air. Tourists whispered to each other, recounting what they had witnessed. Emma's friends stayed close, sharing gentle smiles and supportive words. Even the vendors seemed to notice the shift, resuming their activities with a quieter, more thoughtful energy. The palace gates stood tall, the sunlight glinting off the metal, bearing witness to another story added to the countless moments that had unfolded in its long history. Thomas remained at his post, perfectly still as if nothing had happened. Yet, within him, he carried the quiet satisfaction of having upheld tradition, maintained dignity, and taught a lesson that would ripple far beyond the palace courtyard. He had done so without anger, without words, and without losing composure. And as the tourists moved on, he stood as a symbol of discipline, respect, and the enduring power of silent authority. Emma walked slowly away from the palace gates, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck. The bustling courtyard, once full of excitement and laughter, now felt almost serene, like a quiet river that had been momentarily disturbed and was slowly returning to its natural flow. She could still feel the weight of Thomas's gaze, the quiet authority that had frozen her in place just moments ago. It was a strange feeling, part awe, part embarrassment, and part admiration, and it made her think deeply about her own actions. Her friends stayed close, offering soft reassurances, but they could also sense that Emma was processing something important. "You've learned your lesson," one whispered gently. Emma nodded, her mind replaying the moment over and over. She remembered every detail, the way the guard had stood perfectly still, the slight gesture of his hand, the unwavering gaze that seemed to look right through her. For the first time, she truly understood that respect was not just about rules on signs or instructions. It was about acknowledging the dignity of others and the traditions they represented. As she walked, Emma began to notice things she had previously ignored. The delicate flowers lining the palace courtyard, the intricate designs on the gates, the careful precision with which the guards carried themselves, all of it had taken on a new meaning. She realized that each detail, each gesture, and each rule was part of something much larger than herself. The palace was not just a tourist attraction, it was a living symbol of history, culture, and discipline. And the guards were not just performers, they were guardians of that legacy. Emma's embarrassment slowly transformed into reflection. She thought about how easy it had been to be careless, how simple it was to forget that every action had an impact on others. She remembered the subtle reactions of the crowd, the way their whispers had grown quieter, the way their attention had shifted entirely toward the guard. She realized that respect was a language everyone understood, even without words, and that it could be taught and learned silently. For the first time in her life, Emma paused to truly think about her behavior in public spaces. She had often traveled for fun, adventure, and sightseeing, sometimes forgetting that her actions could affect those around her. But this morning she had learned something profound. Respect was not just about following instructions. It was about awareness, humility, and understanding the world from another person's perspective. She felt a gentle warmth in her chest, a mix of gratitude and humility, and she realized she would never forget this lesson. Her friends noticed the change in her demeanor. "You're quiet," one said. "Are you okay?" Emma smiled softly, a genuine and thoughtful smile. "I'm more than okay," she replied. "I've just realized something important." She explained, hesitating at first, that she had been careless and playful, but that the guard's reaction had taught her more than she could have imagined. Her friends nodded, quietly admiring her newfound understanding and the way she was able to reflect on her actions. As they moved toward the palace exit, Emma took a deep breath and looked back at the guards one last time. Thomas stood perfectly still, his posture flawless, his expression calm and dignified. There was no anger in his gaze, no judgment, only a quiet reminder of the lesson she had learned. She felt a sense of gratitude toward him, not just for maintaining his composure, but for teaching her a lesson in such a profound and silent way. She realized that some lessons were more powerful when experienced than when explained in words, and this was one of those rare moments. Emma's reflection continued as they walked through the streets outside the palace. She noticed how the people around her moved with their own purpose, many unaware of the events that had just unfolded. Yet she carried the memory vividly in her mind. She thought about how small gestures like the guard's slight raise of the hand or the unwavering gaze could communicate volumes. She understood that respect was not forced, it was earned and recognized, often without a single word. She began to think about other moments in her life when she might have overlooked respect. Perhaps she had been careless with friends, with strangers, or with rules she thought were unimportant. She realized that learning to notice these small details, to pause and reflect, was a skill she wanted to cultivate. The morning at the palace had shown her that awareness and humility could transform interactions, making experiences richer and more meaningful. Emma's friends noticed that she was quieter than usual, more thoughtful, and they gave her space. She didn't mind the silence. In fact, she welcomed it. She replayed the moment in her mind again, remembering the exact way Thomas had moved, the calm authority he projected, and the way the crowd had responded. It was a lesson in human behavior, discipline, and the subtle ways respect could be communicated and understood. As they continued walking, Emma felt a growing sense of connection, not just to the palace or the guards, but to the world around her. She realized that every place she visited had its own traditions, rules, and expectations, and that understanding and honoring those could make her experiences richer and more meaningful. She thought about the small ways she could show respect: listening, observing, acknowledging the effort of others, and being aware of the history and significance of the places she visited. Emma paused to sit on a nearby bench, watching as tourists moved about, some laughing, some taking pictures, and some quietly reflecting like she was. She noticed the subtle differences in behavior, the unspoken communication, and the ways respect could be shown even in casual interactions. She realized that Thomas's lesson went beyond the palace gates. It was about life itself, about the way people interacted with each other and with the world around them. Her thoughts turned inward as she considered how she would act differently in the future. She promised herself that she would pause before acting impulsively, that she would observe more carefully, and that she would always strive to understand the consequences of her actions. The experience had given her a new perspective, one that combined curiosity with humility, playfulness with awareness, and freedom with responsibility. Emma's reflection was interrupted by a small group of children nearby who were looking at a street performer. She smiled softly, remembering how she had once run freely, oblivious to boundaries, and now she could see the difference between playful energy and careless behavior. She realized that learning to balance joy with respect was a skill that made experiences richer, safer, and more meaningful for everyone involved. As the morning turned to midday, Emma and her friends continued exploring the city, but her mind kept returning to the palace, the guard, and the lesson she had learned. She noticed every detail, the way people moved, the way history was preserved, and the quiet ways authority and discipline could communicate without a single word. She felt a growing respect for the traditions and the people who maintained them, understanding that these moments were small but powerful threads in the fabric of human culture. By the time they returned to their hotel, Emma's reflection had grown into a quiet gratitude. She felt grateful for the lesson, for the guard's patience, and for the opportunity to learn something meaningful during a trip that she had initially thought would only be about sightseeing and fun. She realized that travel was not just about capturing pictures, but about experiencing culture, observing traditions, and growing as a person. That evening, as Emma journaled about her day, she wrote about the palace, the crowd, and most importantly, the guard who had taught her so much with such subtlety. She reflected on how discipline, respect, and patience could transform moments, interactions, and even personal perspectives. She promised herself that she would carry this lesson forward, not just in her travels but in everyday life, treating people and traditions with awareness, humility, and respect. Emma's transformation was subtle but real. She felt a deeper connection to the world, a growing understanding that her actions mattered, and that respect was a choice made every day. She realized that the lesson had not just been about behavior near the palace gates. It had been about life, human interaction, and the quiet power of patience and dignity. As she drifted off to sleep that night, the memory of Thomas standing perfectly still, his gaze unwavering, and the silent lesson he had imparted stayed with her. She felt a sense of peace, understanding, and growth. The palace, the guard, and the moment had become part of her story, a memory that would guide her actions, shape her awareness, and inspire respect in every interaction she had from that day forward. The day had moved on, but the events at the palace still lingered in the minds of everyone who had been present. Tourists wandered the streets, stopping at cafes, souvenir shops, and historical corners of the city. Yet, despite the bustle, many carried with them the memory of the young tourist and the royal guard, a quiet but powerful moment that seemed to echo far beyond the gates of the palace. Emma walked alongside her friends, her steps slower than usual, as if she were savoring each moment. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows on the cobblestones, and the city seemed alive with activity. But for Emma, everything had changed. Her eyes scanned the surroundings with a new awareness. She noticed the small gestures of respect in others, people queuing patiently, children holding hands with their parents, shopkeepers bowing slightly as customers entered. She realized that respect could be found everywhere if one only chose to observe. Her mind kept returning to Thomas, the guard who had taught her so much in silence. She thought about the discipline it must take to remain perfectly still for hours at a time, to maintain composure regardless of the chaos around him. She imagined the countless tourists he had encountered over the years, some respectful, some curious, and some careless like herself. And she understood more deeply than ever that his power came not from words or anger, but from patience, presence, and dignity. As they passed a small cafe, Emma decided to sit down for a moment. Her friends chatted quietly, but she remained absorbed in her thoughts. She replayed the morning in her mind, from the first playful gestures to the subtle but commanding hand gesture, to the unwavering gaze that had frozen her in place. She realized how profound the lesson had been, how something so simple, so quiet, could teach more than any lecture ever could. Around her, life continued as normal. Children laughed as they chased pigeons, vendors called out their greetings, and tourists snapped photos of the architecture. But for Emma, everything had a new layer of meaning. She understood that respect was not just about following rules. It was about being aware of the impact of one's actions, about noticing the history and significance behind traditions, and about valuing the people who maintain those traditions. Emma thought about how easy it had been to act without consideration. She had been playful, careless, and focused only on fun. But Thomas had shown her, in the most subtle way, that every action had consequences. She realized that learning to pause, to reflect, and to respect boundaries was a skill that could make life richer and interactions more meaningful. It was a skill she wanted to carry forward, not just while traveling, but every day. Her friends noticed the change in her demeanor. "You're very quiet today," one said. Emma smiled softly, a thoughtful and genuine smile. "I'm thinking about what happened," she replied. "It wasn't just a funny moment. It was a lesson." Her friends listened as she described how Thomas had remained calm, how the crowd had watched in awe, and how she had felt the weight of his presence. They nodded, impressed by her insight, realizing that the experience had truly affected her. As they walked back toward their hotel, Emma paused to take a photo. Not a playful, silly one, but a quiet photo of the palace gates. She wanted to remember the beauty of the place, the history it represented, and the lessons she had learned there. She thought about how the guards were not just performers, but protectors of tradition, and how every visitor had a responsibility to show awareness and respect. She felt gratitude not just for the lesson, but for the opportunity to learn it firsthand. Throughout the day, Emma reflected on other situations in her life where she could apply what she had learned. She thought about school, friends, family, and public places she visited. She realized that respect and awareness were universal principles, applicable everywhere. The palace had been a vivid example, but the lesson extended far beyond its gates. It was about human interaction, humility, and the subtle power of presence. Evenings in the city were lively, with streets lit up by soft lamps and restaurants buzzing with conversation. Emma and her friends sat at a small outdoor cafe, sipping warm drinks and enjoying the gentle evening air. Yet, Emma's mind kept returning to the morning, to the silent interaction that had transformed her understanding. She spoke quietly to her friends about how the guard's calm demeanor had commanded respect without a single word, and how powerful that had been. Her friends nodded, understanding the depth of the experience. As the day turned into night, Emma began to journal about the experience. She wrote about the palace gates, the bustling courtyard, the crowd of tourists, and most importantly, Thomas, the guard who had taught her such a profound lesson. She reflected on how his silence had spoken volumes, how his gestures had been more powerful than words, and how she had felt a mix of embarrassment, admiration, and gratitude. Writing it down helped her process the emotions she had felt, making the lesson even more meaningful. She also wrote about the people around her who had witnessed the moment, the tourists who had paused in awe, the children who had quietly observed, and the friends who had guided her. She realized that lessons could ripple outward, affecting not just one person but everyone present. The power of patience, discipline, and silent authority was something that touched multiple lives in a single moment, and she felt privileged to have experienced it firsthand. Emma thought about the role of guardians like Thomas in society. She realized that their discipline was not just for show. It was a responsibility to maintain order, to preserve tradition, and to teach respect. She felt a newfound appreciation for people who worked quietly, faithfully, and diligently, often unnoticed, yet making a profound impact. She understood that true authority was not about loudness or force, but about presence, awareness, and integrity. The next morning, Emma revisited the palace, not to repeat her previous behavior but to observe quietly, respectfully, and attentively. She watched the guards, noting their precision, dedication, and composure. She noticed the small gestures, the way they interacted with the environment, and the unspoken communication between them and the crowd. She felt a sense of peace and admiration, realizing that respect, awareness, and patience were qualities worth cultivating in herself. Throughout the following days of her trip, Emma carried the lesson with her. She acted with more awareness in crowded spaces, spoke politely to strangers, and noticed small details she had previously overlooked. She reflected on the idea that every interaction was an opportunity to show respect, and that awareness of one's actions could prevent misunderstandings and create positive experiences for everyone. The palace incident had become a guiding principle in her life, a reminder that even small actions could have significant impact. Back at the airport, preparing to return home, Emma felt a sense of closure. She looked out the window at the city one last time, appreciating its beauty, history, and the lessons it had offered. She thought about Thomas, standing at his post, teaching her something she would never forget. The memory of the silent guard, the commanding gaze, and the quiet authority stayed with her, leaving an imprint on her mind and heart. She realized that the true value of travel was not just in sightseeing or taking photos, but in learning, observing, and growing as a person. She felt grateful for the experience, for the lesson, and for the awareness it had brought her. She promised herself that she would carry this understanding forward, treating every person, place, and tradition with respect, humility, and attentiveness. As the plane took off, Emma reflected on the journey. She thought about the palace, the crowd, the children, and most of all, the guard. She understood that respect was universal, patience was powerful, and silence could communicate more than words ever could. The lesson would remain with her forever, guiding her actions and shaping her perspective. Even after returning home, Emma found herself recounting the story to friends and family. She spoke about the palace, the guards, and the young tourist who had once been careless, herself. She shared how a single, silent gesture had taught her more than words could, and how she had grown from the experience. Her story inspired others to reflect on their own actions and consider the impact of respect and awareness in their daily lives. In the end, the palace gates, the crowd, and Thomas, the quiet, disciplined guard, had left an indelible mark on her life. The lesson was simple yet profound. Respect was earned, awareness was powerful, and the most meaningful lessons often came in silence. Emma had entered the palace courtyard seeking fun and adventure, but she left with something far greater: wisdom, humility, and a deeper understanding of the world around her.